Right, so last week we started talking about the new film, 303 Battle of England, also known as Hurricane in English. And even though we hadn't seen it at the time, we were kind of setting up the story, and Josh told us about his own experience learning about the 303, was the 303rd Division? Is that right? Squadron. Anyway, we went and saw the film this week. Thank God for cheap Wednesdays at Cinema City, right?
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
And we're back to tell you what we think about the film. Josh, since we got to the setup from you last week, why don't you go first and tell us what you thought about the film?
Okay, well, given that I gave a fairly lengthy exposition of what I knew already or understood already about what happened in the Battle of Britain with the Polish pilots, I was very curious to see how closely the film stuck to the narrative that I was already familiar with. And I can say, actually, that it stuck very, very closely to that. The story... see the fact that initially the pilots were somewhat mistrusted. They were seen as probably not going to be any good, but ultimately they were forced to stick them up in the air because they just didn't have any new pilots, British pilots coming through. And then went on to, shoot down lots of planes, which you got to see in not completely convincing detail, the dogfights, I have to say. And also nice, the order of things was slightly different, but if you remember last week, I talked about the opening of the book that I read, A Question of Honour, was all about the Armistice Parade or the Victory Parade in 1946, where all the Allied troops were represented except for the Poles, and in fact, rather gratifyingly, that is the closing touch in this film.
They blew that scene, if you ask me. There was no need for
Dave, wait your turn.
They blew so many scenes, but okay.
Well, possibly the budget didn't stretch to having 30,000, military personnel lining the Mall and having that closed for the day.
Let's start with the budgetary issues, okay? Before I give a...
Is this your review though right now, or
okay? So I'm not sure how to approach assessing the movie. It slightly exceeded the expectations I laid out in the show last week, but it's still badly short of being a good World War II movie. Now, I'm not sure how long you want me to go on here, John. I'm going to start with something I mentioned last week as well, which is scale, okay? Now, first of all, Scale. Yes, this movie didn't have a huge budget. Now, they did something that you could describe as clever. They spent all of their budget on the dogfight scenes, which were perfectly serviceable, actually. I was surprised how many there were and how entertaining they were. You throw two Spitfires up on Hurricanes up on a big cinema screen, shooting the crap out of each other and ramming each other. It's fairly entertaining. However, that scene is a great example. That the scene that it closes on. We get another awkward conversation between the love interest Stephanie Martini, who I wasn't a big fan of, but we'll get to that. But of course, you can't see the parade. And he's talking. It's one of those classic scenes. You could just have a man with his big, a face full of pathos and madness, like kind of staring at how they stole the legacy, and just have a faint voiceover as the parade passes the window. Have him staring out the window. Don't have him talking to his bit on the side. Okay, nobody cares. Now, this ties into the big problem. They missed all the fun stuff. If you're going to have a movie about the Battle of Britain, where when we set up shots about with showing London exploding during the Blitz, where was the sense of scene setting to show just how large, enormous and dangerous the Nazi machine was?
No time for that.
Give me a lovely pan shot over the divisions of the Luftwaffe lined up, row after row, coming to destroy London.
I think we did get a shot of 4 or 5 German officers lined up.
All the airfield scenes were clearly filmed in the same place. Okay, yeah. Germany, France, England. It was the same field. Okay, it was just a little field.
Wait, Dave, draw a breath. Josh has a comment here.
Just a little historical point, but I think the Blitz was actually after the Battle of Britain.
Fair point. But what I'm trying to say is, you're trying to set up
on a roll, Josh.
The Luftwaffe as the evil empire. Give me some shots of Berlin. Give me, the destruction that the Nazi war machine had already wrought across large swathes of Europe. I want to see what you're up against. It's one of the classic things about making a World War II movie is the Nazis are evil, okay? Everyone knows this. You don't have to sugarcoat it. You don't have to have nuance and balance. You just have to have lots of impressive shots of their stupid uniforms and stuff blowing up. And we were denied all of that because, as I said, this movie doesn't have much scale. It's exactly pretty much what I predicted. A rom-com with some good scenes on the ground and some fighting in the air. Would you like me to go to the positives now, or should I wait until you say things?
Let me jump in here for a second.
Okay.
Let me jump in.
Because I do have positives.
This movie was not it's not horrible. I'll put it that way.
Yeah,
it's not horrible.
It's 2.5 out of 5.
And I think, like Josh, I think like you mentioned, I was ready to savage it before we saw it. I was just assuming that it was going to be really poor. I even had a pithy line ready. I was going to say something like, Battle of Britain still producing bombs 77 years later. Or something like that. Oh, you like that? Huh?
I like
it. But in fairness, the filmmakers have nothing to be ashamed of, given what I assume is their limited resources. Things like cinematography acceptable. I think the pacing lagged in a few places, some questionable editing, but it's not a catastrophe by any measure. I think it suffered from a flaw that affects a lot of war movies. There are too many characters, and so that they're not able to flesh out the backstories. So they just kind of throw them in there, give you 15 seconds of character exposition, and then they just kind of move on. Can I say a word about the completely unnecessary romantic subplot?
Oh, we have to cover this.
Jesus.
We do.
How many movies are ruined, but this one especially.
They bottled it, because one thing I'd like to say is my Polish is not good. Okay, so I was struggling to follow the scenes where the Polish pilots were in digs, where they were drinking, where they were interacting with the English guys, and knocking the starch out of the colonel's collar and all that. But that was clearly the movie's absolute strong point. I'm not deaf to the reaction of my fellow Poles in the cinema, and everyone was loving those scenes. Clearly, the chemistry was great between the main Polish actors. They had something special there, and they bottled it. And I can only give 2 reasons why they might have done it. The Polish pilots were alone. They didn't travel with their families, so you didn't have that natural in with say a backstory. All war movies have to have the family back home grieving and worrying. So they didn't really have that. So maybe they just thought, well, we have to introduce a love element. And I think they also bottled having more...
Love in quotation marks.
I think they also bottled having more scenes in Polish, even though the charisma and the energy between the characters was there for everyone to see. I think they were worried about having too much of the movie take place in Polish. Now, I know it's ironic in the sense that I struggled to follow those parts of the film, and I'm saying they were the strongest parts of the movie, but I thought the reaction from the crowd in the cinema was making it pretty clear they were really enjoying that part of it. And what the love interest added to things, I really don't know.
Not even a love interest. Let's be honest.
Phyllis was her name in the movie.
She's the camp whore.
Oh, come on, John.
Sorry, I'll put it in crude terms.
No, not having that.
Slut.
I'm not having that. It does.
Apologies to the whore.
No, sorry. It does tie into historical fact that there was a huge loosening in English society of the parameters of what women were allowed to do. They were. The war was a very interesting time for women's rights, for the progression of
we're not talking about rights. We're talking about sleeping with half the camp. That's basically what she had.
She had a bit of fun, I mean, they could have all been dead a couple of months later, Yeah.
Well, I think that was the point that was, continually being made, and I think that probably is one of the holdovers from the Second World War and the kind of loosening of moral values. Then was that people were like, well, if I don't do it now, am I ever going to?
All right, let me throw this out there. What about, and Josh, I think you'll have something to say about this. What about the fact that they use some almost cartoonish stereotypes to kind of simplify things? The out of touch upper class English officers, the tough, scrappy enlisted men, this kind of thing.
Well, actually, I mean, when I was younger, growing up, I mean, the kind of black and white World War II movies were almost a staple of Sunday afternoon TV. I watched probably all of the ones going, and some of the more recent ones, and. Well, the fact is that, I mean, the officer classes did all have those accents in those days. I mean, that's exactly how they spoke. And in fact, if they really got that right, then it would have sounded like something from Harry Enfield. Your
man was quite fun, the colonel, wasn't he?
I know, it was Air Vice Marshal Dowding.
Excuse me. Yeah.
Chief Marshal Dowding. Yeah, he was very good. I mean, he was so familiar, but I couldn't place
I
him.
couldn't either. Yeah.
But he was absolutely. I mean, these people, the savages. They don't
But
know.
I also mean, and we should have said earlier, spoiler alert everywhere, but it's too late for that.
Yeah, we won the war.
There are bar scenes where the English officers are the arrogant, just really nasty. The Polish guys are friendly and open. The English guys are standoffish and kind of, you people are animals. And I thought it was really kind of ham-fisted character.
I think Josh is touching on something that's true, is that, yeah, it was ham-fisted, but it is pretty much what happened. I just think it's more generally, it's just very hard to make the tone of a World War II movie now ring true, because there's just been so many great ones down the years that, it's very easy to sit through a movie like this and feel, meh, it didn't really grab you. It had its strengths. It had a lot more weaknesses. We haven't even touched on the most boring score ever committed to a movie.
Oh, yeah. God. Yeah.
And I'm sure there's a weird scene in it where he punches a journalist out on the field. And I was kind of, at the time, I was like, well, what was that for? And then later they kind of throw in this scene where he's explaining it to what was your man's name? Dowding, yeah. Which felt like we didn't have the money for post-production kind of touch.
Let's go back to the music for a second here. Afterwards, I was thinking about it. It seemed like the musical equivalent of Microsoft Word clip art.
Oh my God, it was dreadful.
Just a generic, off the shelf. It's horrible.
It's to be expected, though. I mean, when you have
quite possibly what it was.
Exactly. I mean, when you have a movie trying to deliver a big budget story on a small budget, the score is nearly always one of the first things to go. I mean, you check out the difference between the soundtrack on, say, something like Dunkirk, which was just chillingly good, like absolutely brilliant. I think that was Zimmer.
Yeah, it was. But actually, I'll interrupt very briefly, as someone who knows a little bit about this, but actually the soundtrack or the score, the music in a film is the very, very last thing to go on. Really the last thing, to the extent that most of the time when you see a trailer in the cinema, you won't be hearing the soundtrack of the film. You'll be hearing generic trailer soundtrack music of the appropriate type. And if you could be bothered to record soundtracks of the trailers that you see over the years, you'd hear the same music over and over again. It's just you don't.
Also, now I know I'm not an expert to judge this, but when all the Polish lads were locked in the room, all having long Polish conversations, there was, to me, an elephant in the room. I'm not sure that's, what's his name again? Ivan Rion from Game of Thrones, Ramsay Bolton fame. I'm not sure I think it's dubbed. He definitely does a good job with the English accent of a Polish person. I actually was really impressed by that, because that's something you can really mess up, and it's a good performance. The kid can act, don't get me wrong. I don't know what age he is, but I called him the kid anyway. But I wasn't bored. I'd love to hear from some of our Polish listeners, of which there are millions, if they thought what I think, which is that the scenes where you had to speak more than a few words of Polish, it was dubbed in afterwards. I don't know. Did you notice anything fishy, John?
Didn't stand out, but I will say, I'll just second what you already said, that his accent, when speaking English as a Polish person,
very good,
was dead on.
Yeah.
Excellent. So, what did you guys think about speaking of languages, what did you think about the multilingual mechanic? More or less half Polish, half English, a little bit of German thrown in. But do you think that works in a film where you keep transitioning back and forth from one to the other?
Yeah, I think that works. It's a lot better. It's not unusual. It's dead in the water now, the whole having the Polish aircrew only speak English in a dodgy accent, okay? They had hard choices to make, the filmmakers, on that front. I think that's why we got so much love story. Very ungenerous characterization of Stephanie Martini from John there. I wouldn't go that far. I'm sure the girl is very talented, and the character she's based on was had a heart of gold, John. Had a heart of gold.
Heart of gold, yeah.
There are some good scenes where she's directing the planes in, but then they ruin that by having the most comedic, over-the-top British villainry ever committed to screen. Yes. Now, do you remember that from the book? Because I'll bow my head in shame if that's actually true to real life. I mean, fair enough if it is, but if it isn't, it's the most comically overblown piece of script writing I've ever seen in my life.
Speaking of the script, I thought that the dialogue was just awful.
I wouldn't say awful. It certainly wasn't good.
Stilted,
I think they have
forced.
to. I mean, it's often this argument about stereotyping and whether whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And I think when you're looking at something that is really now ancient history, it's beyond. I mean, my parents were small children in the Second World War, and I'm not young anymore, so you kind of. Stereotypes are very effective in terms of painting, a picture in broad strokes. And I don't have any problem really with British officers being terribly, and
as you say, they were in the main,
and the wafts, on the whatever those things where they slide counters around, look like giant croupiers. They were all kind of chirpy girls with estuary accents, which was probably about right, really.
Mm-hmm. I'd have to agree. I'd have to lump it in with stuff like The Imitation Game. Was that the one with Benedict Cumberbatch pretending to be Alan Turing?
Yes.
And destroying the man's legacy, implying he was a Soviet spy. Actually, we should review that, and I'll give that a kick, and that Benedict will never forget. Thank you for pissing all over Alan Turing's legacy, Benedict, if you're listening.
That's a different movie.
You are a disgrace to Britain.
All right, let's jump to the bottom line. Do you recommend this film or not?
I think that Polish people will enjoy it purely for the scenes with the interplay between the Polish characters and the English characters. I think if anything, we're being a little hard on it, possibly now that I'm listening to us. It certainly at least met my expectations going in. I thought it had some charm. I thought the filmmakers made some bad decisions. I thought they took what was on its way to being a 3.5 to 4-star movie and turned it into a 2-star movie, with mainly the overdoing of the romantic subplot.
I think it's a story that needs to be told, maybe not so much for the Polish viewers, but I think there's probably a large number of people in Britain, and probably an increasing number in Britain, who had absolutely no idea about that particular contribution to the war effort, which was a very significant one. And yeah, I know that most people aren't aware of that. So, and the film is certainly good enough that you get the story. And
I don't see this as a general interest film. I think you need to have some kind of Polish connection. You have to be a World War II movie junkie or some kind of academic interest maybe in this aspect of the war. I don't see just your average mainstream moviegoer saying, okay, I'll take a look at this and coming away satisfied. It's just, I don't know. I give it a 6 out of 10. I think, which is what it has right now on IMDb. If I'm not mistaken.
I think if Spielberg watched this, I don't think he'd bring his notepad. Put it that way. I mean, there is an element that, the story's been told, but would you be better off just watching the Timeline documentary on YouTube, which we'll put a link up to for anybody who's interested? I think you would. And do you know what? After the movie, I watched that documentary, and like Josh says, they certainly were careful not to butcher any historical facts, and they have to be given credit for that, I think, because so often, I'm not going to say Hollywood because it's not a Hollywood production, but you know what I mean, John.
I think so.
I'm blaming America on stuff.
Yeah, everything's our fault one way or another. Yeah,
absolutely.
The movie's called Hurricane.
You blame California for a lot of stuff too.
That's another podcast. The movie's called Hurricane, Battle of England. We checked on this because we were a bit confused by the way.
Poles do call it the Battle of England.
In English we call it the Battle of Britain, but in Poland they call it the Battle of England. So I don't know what happened to Wales.
As Scotland. Josh said last week, it's probably more accurate, isn't it? I mean, most of the fighting was done over.
Yeah, well, in fact, the Battle of Southeast England would probably be.
That's too long for a movie title. Anyway, go check it out on a Wednesday like we did. Get half price at Cinema City.
Yeah, very cheap.
Yeah, and Cinema City, if you're listening, here's your new reviewers.